Okay, so let's continue chapter 3, and this is the last video for the chapter. So in this part, we are talking about the long run demand for workers or labor. And if the wage rate drops, there are two important effects. And of course, you can think of it, if wage rate increases, then just you flip, the effects. So the first one is called the scale effect. And I want you to remember the income effect in the previous chapter. So this is like the equivalent of the income effect for the worker. And there is another effect, which is the substitution effect, which has the same name as the substitution effect for the worker. So if the wage drops, there are two effects. Firms, of course, will take advantage of the lower price and they will expand production. It's the same idea as expanding, as the effect of increasing income. Okay, so here they are expanding production. We call it the scale effect. Previous chapter we said it's the income effect. And the other thing is, if we are talking about two inputs or more than two inputs, then every time there is a drop in the cost of one of the inputs, then you will employ more of that input as compared to the other inputs. So if we have a drop in the wage rate, then you will be employing more workers and less of the other inputs. So this is why we say it's a substitution effect. You are substituting workers for the other inputs, which are now relatively expensive. So looking at this graph, we are going to see the impact of the wage reduction holding constant other costs of production. So we have on the y-axis, we have capital, right? We have workers or employment. We have the ISO cost line, and we have the ISO quant curve, okay? And we have two ISO quants and we have two ISO cost. So this graph is about a drop in wages, okay? So the original point of equilibrium that we discussed before was point P. We said point P is the optimal combination between capital and workers that would give the same amount of production, that the same as any other point on the isoquant. And here the firm is hiring 25 workers and 75 units of capital. So what if the wage rate drops? So if the wage rate decreases, then there is a rotation in the ISO cost line. So you have a bigger intercept now, you are hiring more workers, right? And you are also moving from point P to a higher point, point R, because you have a higher amount of profit, right? You're producing more and you are on a higher point or higher optimal point. Okay, the other intercept stays constant because we assume that total cost stays the same, interest rate does not change. So this point, this intercept stays constant. What changes here is this intercept is becoming this intercept. We used to have C naught, which is the cost, over W naught. Now we have it C naught, the same C, but over W1. And if this drops, then the whole ratio increases. And that's why we are moving to a bigger point, bigger intercept. Okay? The wage reduction on the output and employment for a profit maximizing firm. So we already said that in order to decide how many units to produce, they would look for the point of intersection between marginal cost and the price. And here, for example, is 100 units. However, if there is a wage cut, then the marginal cost of production decreases, and this encourages the firm to expand. right? Marginal cost of production is simply how much you are paying for the additional worker. You are paying less because wages is getting less, and this encourages the firm to expand production. So they are expanding production from 100 to 150. Now looking at this optimal combination, so they are moving from point P to point R. And this means there is an increase in the number of workers from 25 to 50. And they are on a higher isoquant curve. So they are producing more from 100 to 150. Again, 100, 150. This is the output, and this is each and every point along the isoquant is giving the same level of output. Substitution and scale effect. Remember, the same idea. Substitution and income effect that we had in the previous chapter. So if you already understood what we discussed in the previous chapter, then this is exactly the same idea. So we said that we are moving from point P to point R. But however, there is a point or an intermediate point that we call point Q. So movement from P to Q and then from Q to R. So P to Q is the scale effect, which is basically coming from the fact that the drop in wages encouraged the producer to expand production. And that's why we see that there is the same parallel isocost line. They are parallel because there is no change in wage here. This is just a scale effect. This is just a pure increase in production from 100 to 150. I want you to notice that this is movement number 1, but this is movement number 2. They are although on the same isoquant curve of 150, but they have different levels of production, different levels of employment of workers. So the substitution effect is the second point here, which is the movement from Q to R, where this substitution effect is coming from the fact that the drop in wages is encouraging firms to substitute workers for capital. Okay, so they are hiring more workers and less capital. Okay, so they have labor intensive methods now, and this leads to an increase in employment. Okay, so there are special cases of the isoquant curve. Sometimes you will see it like as a straight line. Okay, so it's a linear. Okay, so they are always workers. It's linear at each and every point, right? So it's an equal slope. But this one, for example, is giving us that it's 2 workers are substituting 1 machine. Okay, this is 100 and this is 200. We can also have isoquant curve that looks like a right angle. Okay, and this one is showing us that the 2 inputs are perfectly complements. So if they have a right angle, then they are complements and perfect complements. So what does that mean? Basically, if the firm decided to produce the same output, so it's going to be producing, for example, I'm just saying isoquant has to have the same level of production. Let's say 500 units, then this is 500. If they hire 20, 25, 30, 35, any number of workers, they're going to have exactly the same level of output. Of course, this is not realistic, but those are 2 special cases. The last thing to discuss in this chapter, and I leave the rest for you to read, is the elasticity of substitution. Okay, so it's the percentage change in the capital to labor ratio given a percentage change in the price ratio. So the percentage change in capital to labor versus a percentage change in the price ratio, which is wages to interest. Okay, so each and every time we are talking about elasticity, we are talking again about 1 unit change. What's going to happen in the capital labor ratio, or what is the percentage change in the capital labor ratio because of a percent change in price ratio. So price ratio changes first, and this is like we are testing the degree of response. So if we are saying that the elasticity of substitution is 5, then 10% increase in the ratio of prices is going to lead to a 50% change in capital to labor ratio, which is big, right? And again, the concept of elasticity was discussed in the previous chapter and also in the microeconomics class. So I would encourage you, if you don't remember it, to go ahead and check what is elastic, inelastic, perfectly elastic, infinitely elastic, and so on. Okay, short and long run demand curves, whether short or long term, they have the same y and x axis. So we're talking about price, the dollars, and employment. Okay, so as you can see here, in the short run we have a steeper demand curve as compared to the long run, where we have relatively a flatter curve. And then on the long run we have, as a firm, they have more opportunities by the change in the wage rate. So wage rate is more flexible in the long run as compared to the short run. Okay. The Marshall's rule is basically talking about when can we find the labor demand elastic. And all of these points, or these 4 points, make sense. If I'm able to substitute easily, right, between labor and capital, then this increases the elasticity. So elasticity of substitution is greater, implies labor demand is more elastic. Elasticity of demand for the firm's output is greater, right? So I'm able to, let's say, reduce the price a little bit, and then I'm able to gain the market. So this means that I will demand more workers, and if this happens, then we are talking about more elastic demand. And then labor share in the total cost is greater than any other input, then this definitely would lead to an increase in the elasticity of labor. Elasticity of supply of other factors such as capital is greater, so that also would lead to an increase in the elasticity of the demand for workers. Okay, so starting from here, I would leave the remaining 7 slides for you to read. They are relatively simple, and there is an application that I want you to check. Okay, so it's very important. And if you have any questions, please leave it on the discussion forum. All right, thank you.